Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-69, a massive 400-page omnibus bill. Now, Canadians will remember during the last election when the Prime Minister put his hand over his heart and made the solemn declaration to Canadians that he would never, ever, ever introduce anything resembling an omnibus bill. And yet, here we are, yet again, with another omnibus bill from this government. And it gets even worse, Mr. Speaker, because this government has seen fit to invoke time allocation after 2 hours of debate. Time allocation after just 2 hours of debate on a bill that is a massive bill, that is a complex bill, that is going to rewrite the environmental assessment process, that is going to have a profound impact on jobs and the economy. Mr. Speaker, I say shame on this government for doing that. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to devote my time, and I should say I'm going to be splitting my time, Mr. Speaker, to clarify, but in the short time that I have, I'm going to be focusing on Part 2 of Bill C-69, this massive omnibus bill. Part 2 establishes a new approval process for energy projects, including pipelines. It is going to have a profound impact upon my province of Alberta and thousands of my constituents who live in St. Albert and Northwest Edmonton, whose jobs are tied directly or indirectly to the energy sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of the Environment, in speaking on Bill C-69 in this House, said that the objectives of Bill C-69 include improving public confidence in the approval process and strengthening investor confidence and making the energy sector more competitive, growing the Canadian economy, and creating good middle-class jobs. That's what the minister said, and, Mr. Speaker, who could disagree with those objectives? Those are laudable objectives. The only problem, Mr. Speaker, is that Bill C-69 will achieve none of those objectives. Rather, what Bill C-69 means is it means keeping energy in the ground. That's what Bill C-69 means, and I know that for the Prime Minister's principal secretary and chief political strategist, Gerald Butts, keeping Canadian energy in the ground is something that he has long fantasized about. Mr. Speaker, what Bill C-69 means is gutting an assessment process based upon science and evidence that balanced environmental and economic issues with an assessment process that is politicized from top to bottom. How is the process politicized from top to bottom? Well, Mr. Speaker, let's start with who gets to appear and make submissions to the regulator. Who has standing, Mr. Speaker? Presently, in order to have standing before the National Energy Board, one must be impacted directly by a project, or one must have relevant knowledge or information about a project. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-69 eliminates that criteria and replaces it with any member of the general public. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is that it is open season. It is an invitation to Gerald Butts' friends and the Minister of Environment's friends and the radical anti-oil sands movement to take over the process, to control the process with their ideological and political agenda to shut down Alberta's oil sands. A movement that is funded by U.S. money, filled with activists who are, in many cases, nothing more than shills for foreign interests, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of the Environment says that that is going to restore public confidence in the assessment process. Mr. Speaker, what it's going to do is completely politicize the process, and it's going to result in delay in terms of the approval of projects. But, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of the Environment says in terms of delay, don't worry about delay. Don't worry about delay because Bill C-69 is going to streamline the approval process, but it's going to reduce the time to see major projects approved. Except when the Minister makes that assertion, she is conveniently overlooking the fact that Bill C-69 imposes, before the assessment process begins, a planning process. A planning process that is a 6-month process, 180 days, and when that is taken into account, it will not reduce the time, it will add about 100 days to the time in which a project could be approved. Now, Mr. Speaker, if all we were talking about was an additional 100 days, we probably wouldn't be having this debate. But, Mr. Speaker, it gets worse because the Minister, on the basis of a political whim influenced by George Soros-funded activists, can extend the timeline. She can extend the delay. But, Mr. Speaker, it even gets worse than that, because the Minister can kill the project at the planning stage before any scientific analysis is done, before any environmental analysis is done, before any economic analysis is done. In other words, the Minister can kill a pipeline project purely on the basis of a raw political decision. And the Minister says that this is going to increase investor confidence. Is that some kind of a joke, Mr. Speaker? It's not going to increase investor confidence. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to drive billions of dollars of investment south of the border and to other energy-producing jurisdictions that are allowing their energy sectors to grow and thrive. Mr. Speaker, make no mistake about it. If Bill C-69 is passed, not one major energy project will be approved in this country. Mr. Speaker, before another major pipeline project is killed, it's imperative that this Parliament kill Bill C-69.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable colleague across the way for his speech. I find it interesting that the NDP, in their speeches, the government's not doing enough, and the Conservatives, the government is doing too much. So that tells me that we found the right kind of balance in this bill. But it's really rich to hear from the other side who gutted environmental regulation, who had gutted the staff of environment and climate change. I guess the question I have for the other member is, has there ever been an environmental regulation that he actually liked?
In Albert and Edmonton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, the assessment process under the previous Conservative government was among the strongest in the world, and that was widely recognized. What our previous Conservative government did in 2012 was we streamlined the process. We streamlined the process to increase investor confidence, to increase investment in the energy sector without in any way diminishing environmental standards. And Mr. Speaker, that was a very successful process, unlike what we have seen over the last 2 years, where we have seen billions of dollars of investment driven out of the energy sector. In fact, there has been the largest drop in investment in the energy sector over the last 2 years under this government's watch than Canada has seen in 70 years. That's the record of this government.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honneur député de Trois.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. In the previous legislature, when the Conservatives changed the Navigable Waters Protection Act to become the Navigation Protection Act, I was a fierce opponent of this approach. In that approach, there was the idea that about 100 lakes and rivers would be protected and identified in an annex of the Act. What we're seeing now is that the Liberals are bringing back the title Protection of Navigable Waters, and they're keeping the Conservative approach. Does my colleague agree that when it comes to their approach, it seems like false advertising? It seems like a trademark of the Liberals, that they lead people to believe one thing that the bill does not actually deliver.
I agree with the honourable member for Trois-Rivières' comment that the Liberals like to say one thing to appeal to their base and then almost always do quite another. And Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Navigable Waters Act and changes that are provided for in Bill C-69, I would say that I do have concerns with those measures, perhaps not necessarily the same concerns that the honourable member for Trois-Rivières has, but the bottom line is what the changes that are being brought forward in Bill C-69 with respect to navigable waters means is that it's going to make it more difficult. There are going to be more roadblocks and more impediments to getting critical infrastructure built.
Questions and comments. We have time for a very brief question, brief reply. The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Liberals like to put out lofty promises and words, and they went to the UN and proudly declared they were going to implement the UN Declaration, which really required certain things of them. And I would like to ask my colleague if he sees any evidence of that commitment that they made so proudly in this particular bill, particularly around the issues of how they're going to receive consent.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou for that question. You know, again, in terms of false advertising that the member for Trois-Rivières referred to, one example of that is this Liberal government's claim that this bill somehow strengthens Indigenous input. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, is that Canada has had a long-standing legal framework around Indigenous consultation. What we have seen from this government, the record of this government, instead of consulting with Indigenous communities, this government is blocking major pipeline and other energy projects, preventing Indigenous communities from entering into equitable partnerships. That's what this government is doing without consulting Indigenous communities.